The Star and the Soldier. The stifling heat of the Italian hospital tent clung to Dean like a wool blanket, smelling of antiseptic and despair. Outside, the distant thud of artillery fire was a constant, unwelcome heartbeat. He'd been cajoled into this visit by a well-meaning USO officer told it would lift spirits. But the truth was, his own spirit felt as battered as the makeshift cots around him. Then he saw him, a young soldier barely out of his teens lying pale and still, a bandage wrapped around his head like a crown of thorns. His eyes, though, were intensely alive, tracking Dean's movements. "Martini," the soldier croaked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Heard you were coming." Dean approached the cot, forcing a grin. "Just Dean, kid. What's your name?" "Eddie. Eddie Valenti, from Cleveland." A flicker of hometown pride crossed his face. "My ma, she always said I looked a bit like you." Dean chuckled, a hollow sound. "You're a handsome devil, Eddie. You'll be back home charming the ladies in no time." Eddie's smile faltered. He knew, and Dean knew he knew, that wasn't true. His breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. "There's something I need to ask." His voice was barely a whisper. Dean leaned closer, the smell of blood faint beneath the sterile air. "My sister, Maria. She's studying to be a singer. She's got a voice, Dean. A real voice. But she's shy. She needs a push, someone to believe in her." He paused, a spasm of pain crossing his face. If I don't make it back, promise me, Dean. Promise you'll look out for her. Just make sure she gets a chance." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. This wasn't a request for an autograph or a song. This was a dying man's final plea, a transfer of responsibility. Dean saw the raw hope, the desperate love in Eddie's eyes. He didn't hesitate. "I promise, Eddie," he said, his voice firm, meeting the soldier's gaze. "I swear it. I'll make sure she gets her chance." A profound sense of relief washed over Eddie's face. He nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. His hand, thin and trembling, reached out and Dean instinctively took it. The grip was surprisingly strong, a fleeting connection between a star and a soldier, a silent pact forged amidst the chaos of war. Later that night, back in his tent, the image of Eddie's eyes haunted Dean. The weight of the promise settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a silent, sacred trust. He knew with a chilling certainty that Eddie Valenti wouldn't be going home, and Dean Martin, the crooner, the charmer, found himself bound by a secret commitment that would shape his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He pulled out a small notepad, scribbling down the name. Maria Valenti, Cleveland. A star had promised a soldier, and the universe, it seemed, was now complicit. A promise whispered. The air in the makeshift infirmary hung thick with the metallic tang of antiseptic and the heavier scent of dread. Dean Martin, his trademark nonchalance replaced by a grave stillness, fixed his gaze on the young soldier. Sergeant Miller, barely old enough to shave, seemed even more boyish now, his face a ghostly pale against the stark white of the pillow. The doctor, his features etched with profound weariness, had just delivered the grim prognosis. Perhaps an hour. Dean knelt beside the cot, his voice a low, gravelly offering. "Sergeant, is there anything I can do for you?" Miller's eyes, clouded with pain, struggled to find focus. He managed a fragile smile. "Just one thing, Mr. Martin. I have a sister, Clara. She's kind-hearted, but she's alone. My parents are gone. She's in Dayton, Ohio. Works at the library." His breath hitched, a ragged sound. She always dreamed of college. To be a teacher. Never had the chance. Dean's expression softened. He'd witnessed countless men meet their end, but never one so young, so brimming with unfulfilled aspirations. "What about her, Sergeant?" "Promise me, Mr. Martin," Miller rasped, his grip on Dean's hand surprisingly strong for a dying man. "Promise me you'll ensure she gets that opportunity. Find her. Help her. Don't let her merely exist. She deserves more." A single tear carved a clean path through the dust on his cheek. "She's a good kid. Truly good." The weight of the plea settled upon Dean's shoulders like a physical mantle. This wasn't a request for a melody or an autograph. It was a dying man's final hope, a sacred trust placed in his hands. The distant rumble of artillery seemed to recede, swallowed by the profound quiet of that small clinical space. Dean met the young soldier's imploring gaze, seeing not just Miller, but the echoes of countless unsung heroes whose sacrifices too often went unacknowledged. "I promise you, Sergeant," Dean affirmed, his voice resonating with an unshakable resolve. "I promise I will find your sister, Clara, and I will ensure she attends college. She will become a teacher. You have my solemn word." A flicker of serenity smoothed the lines on Miller's face. He squeezed Dean's hand once more, a silent acknowledgement of the vow taken. Moments later, the sergeant's grip slackened, and the shallow rhythm of his breathing ceased. The doctor nodded somberly, drawing a sheet over the young man's face. Dean rose, the promise a silent, smouldering ember within his core. It was a commitment forged in the crucible of death, a secret he would carry, a whispered pledge sealed in that moment, destined to subtly steer the unseen currents of his life for decades to come. The silent oath, the field hospital tent reeked of antiseptic and despair. Dean Martin, his usual swagger replaced by a somber quietness, moved through the crowded cots. He'd come to entertain, to offer a fleeting distraction from the horrors of war, but the face on the cot in front of him wasn't looking for a song. Sergeant Miller was a young man, barely older than Dean himself, with eyes that had seen too much and now held a fading light. A medic was gently adjusting his IV. "Mr. Martin?" Miller rasped, a faint smile touching his bloodless lips. "Never thought I'd see you here." Dean leaned closer, the cacophony of groans and hushed conversations fading into a dull thrum. "Just Dean, Sergeant. What can I do for you?" He sat on the edge of the cot, ignoring the medic's subtle shake of the head. Miller's hand, surprisingly strong, gripped Dean's arm. "My sister, Clara. She's alone. No one else. I promised her I'd always look out for her." His breath hitched, a thin rattling sound. "She's got a small house, just outside Phoenix. Needs work. Needs looking after." His gaze, clear and intense, locked onto Dean's. "You're a good man, Dean, I can tell. Will you look after her? Just make sure she's all right." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. This wasn't a casual request, it was a dying man's plea, a final testament. Dean saw not just Miller, but every soldier, every family left behind. His throat tightened. He looked into those fading eyes and knew he couldn't refuse. "I will, Sergeant," Dean said, his voice a low, firm murmur. "I promise you. I'll make sure Clara's all right." Miller's grip loosened, a profound peace settling over his face. "Thank you," he whispered, a final exhale. The light in his eyes dimmed, then vanished. Dean sat there for a long moment, the silent oath burning a hole in his soul. He stood, a new weight settling onto his shoulders. The noise of the hospital tent rushed back in, but for Dean, everything had changed. He walked out, past the nurses and the endless rows of wounded, a secret commitment now bound to his very essence. No one knew, no one ever would, but the promise was made and it would be kept. Years of hidden kindness. The crisp autumn air bit at Dean's cheeks as he stepped out of the hospital, the scent of antiseptic clinging to his clothes. Sergeant Miller's words, raspy and urgent, echoed in his mind. "Look after my sister, Mr. Martin. No one else will." It was a plea, a deathbed wish, from a man whose eyes held the weary resignation of a soldier facing his final battle. Dean, who'd only meant to offer a few kind words, found himself bound by a promise he hadn't fully considered until it was too late to back out. He found Clara Miller in a small apartment above a bustling bakery, the scent of cinnamon and yeast, a warm contrast to the chill in the air. She was a woman etched with hardship, her face a roadmap of silent struggles. Her brother's death, Dean learned, had left her not just grieving but financially adrift, burdened by debts and a chronic illness that made regular work impossible. Dean began with anonymous gifts of cash, tucked discreetly into envelopes left with the bakery owner, citing an old friend who wished to remain unnamed. Years blurred into a rhythm of quiet vigilance. Dean, now a burgeoning star, juggled recording sessions and film shoots with clandestine trips to Clara's neighbourhood. He'd send a trusted aide with grocery vouchers or arrange for a doctor's visit, always through intermediaries, always without a trace back to him. There were times when the demands on his schedule were immense, when the urge to delegate fully or simply cease the charade became a gnawing temptation. particularly lucrative engagement in Vegas almost coincided with Clara's sudden need for an expensive specialist. Dean chose the specialist, quietly absorbing the cost, even as his manager grumbled about missed opportunities. The hardest part wasn't the money, though it was substantial over 2 decades. It was the secrecy, the constant vigilance against discovery. He learned to deflect questions, to craft plausible excuses for his occasional disappearances, all while maintaining the jovial, carefree persona the public adored. Once a nosy reporter, sniffing around his charity work, almost stumbled upon Clara's address. Dean, with a well-placed joke and a diversionary anecdote, steered the conversation so smoothly that the reporter left none the wiser, chuckling at Dean's wit. 25 years after that hospital room promise, Clara Miller passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her small funeral was attended by a handful of neighbours and a quiet man in the back obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Dean felt a profound, bitter-sweet release. The burden of his secret, heavy for so long, lifted. He had kept his word, a silent testament to a dying man's trust, a promise woven into the fabric of his extraordinary life, unseen and unacknowledged. Sacrifice and secrecy. The scent of stale antiseptic and a faint metallic tang clung to the air in the makeshift infirmary. Dean's eyes, usually sparkling with an easy charm, were now shadowed, fixed on the pale, drawn face of Sergeant Miller. A thin, reedy cough racked the man's frame, a crimson bloom spreading on the bandage over his chest. Miller's gaze, though clouded with pain, held a desperate clarity. "Mr. Martin," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I have a son. Thomas. Just a boy." Dean knelt closer, the rough wool of his uniform scratching his knees. "What about him, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice soft, devoid of its usual croon. The cacophony of distant gunfire and hurried footsteps outside the tent seemed to fade, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of his own pulse. "His mother. She passed before I left. He's with my sister, Clara, in Ohio, but she's struggling. He needs more than she can give. He's bright, Mr. Martin. So bright." Miller's hand, trembling, reached out, grasping Dean's sleeve. "Promise me. Promise you'll look out for him. Not just financially. Be a presence, a silent guardian, until he's grown. No one needs to know. Just promise me." The plea was raw, etched with the finality of a dying man's wish. Dean looked into those fading eyes, saw the soul-deep fear for a child left behind. The weight of the request settled heavy on his chest, a solemn vow forming unspoken. "I promise, Sergeant," he said, the words firm, unwavering. "On my honour." A fragile smile touched Miller's lips, a flicker of peace in the face of oblivion. His grip slackened, and his eyes, fixed on some unseen horizon, slowly closed. Dean remained there, a silent vigil, the sounds of the war returning to his awareness, sharper, more insistent. He had made a promise that day, a deeply personal commitment to a man he'd known for only a few fleeting moments. This wasn't about publicity or charity galas or public adulation. It was about a dying man's trust, a silent pact sealed in the shadow of war. 25 years later, the weight of that promise was a familiar presence. Dean sat in his spacious study, a stack of bills for Thomas Miller's university tuition spread across the mahogany desk. He picked up a framed photograph of a young man in a cap and gown, Thomas's beaming face a testament to the future Sergeant Miller had dreamed of. Dean smiled, a private, knowing smile. He had paid for Thomas's education, his first car, even discreetly ensuring a down payment on a small house when he started his family. He'd done it all, without a word, directing his assistant, Frank, to handle the logistics, always under the guise of anonymous donations from a vague charitable trust. Frank, ever loyal, had never questioned, merely executed the instructions with quiet efficiency, an unsaid understanding passing between them. The secret was a thread woven tightly into the fabric of Dean's life, a silent testament to a promise made to a dying soldier, a commitment nobody else knew existed. Martha's growing questions. The scent of stale coffee and disinfectant clung to Martha's uniform as she pushed through the double doors of the Veterans Affairs office. Sunlight, a thin, watery presence even at midday, barely pierced the grimy window panes. Her mind, usually a neatly organised filing cabinet, was a jumble of unindexed questions. The file she clutched, belonging to Private James Jimmy O'Connell, felt heavier than its few pages suggested. "Anything on O'Connell, Martha?" Agnes, a woman whose stern face belied a kind heart, looked up from her overflowing desk. Martha shook her head, a sigh escaping her lips. Still nothing substantial, just the basic enlistment, injury report, and this. She tapped the single faded photograph clipped to the file. A young man, barely out of boyhood, grinned into the camera, arms slung over another, taller figure. The second man's face was obscured by shadow and blur, but something about his posture, the tilt of his head, nagged at Martha. Heard Dean Martin was a regular visitor in the early days, Agnes mused, swivelling her chair, before the big tours really kicked off. Always brought him gifts, apparently. Martha's eyebrows shot up. Dean Martin, the singer? She knew the name, of course, everyone did. But what would a rising star have to do with a quiet, forgotten private like Jimmy O'Connell? The incongruity sparked a new flicker of curiosity, a tiny flame in the dim corners of her inquiry. Later that afternoon, a chance encounter in the hospital corridor further fueled her nascent suspicions. To Evans, a kindly but often absent-minded physician, was shuffling through a stack of old patient charts. "Ah, Martha," he mumbled, peering over his spectacles. "Just found this in the O'Connell file. Not sure why it wasn't with the rest." He handed her a small handwritten note. The handwriting was elegant, almost artistic. It was dated a few months after O'Connell's death. The note simply read, "Thank you for everything." He would have been grateful. D.M. D.M. Dean Martin. The initials were too perfect, too coincidental. Martha's breath hitched. Why would Dean Martin be sending a thank you note to the hospital staff after O'Connell's death? What everything was he thanking them for? And why the deep sense of obligation implied by "he would have been grateful"? That evening, as the city lights began to twinkle outside her small apartment window, Martha spread O'Connell's file across her kitchen table. The blurred figure in the photograph, the cryptic note, Agnes's casual remark about visits, and now this thank you letter. Each piece, insignificant on its own, now seemed to align, forming the faint outline of a larger, unspoken narrative. A promise, perhaps? A deep personal connection that defied public knowledge? The air in her small kitchen felt thick with unspoken secrets. Martha knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had only just begun to scratch the surface of Jimmy O'Connell's story, and by extension, Dean Martin's. The unveiling of a heart. The crisp air of the late autumn afternoon bit at Dean's exposed hands as he pushed through the swinging doors of the Veterans Administration Hospital. The sterile scent of antiseptic and old coffee was a familiar, unwelcome greeting. He clutched a small nondescript package to his chest, its contents a secret he'd guarded for over 2 decades. Today, that secret would finally see the light. He found Mrs. Henderson in the bustling reception area, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she recognized him. "Mr. Martin," she said, her voice a soft murmur amidst the clatter. "He's expecting you." Dean nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. The he was Arthur, the son of the dying veteran whose last request had silently bound Dean for 25 years. Arthur, a man now in his late 40s, bore a striking resemblance to his father, the same earnest gaze, the same proud set of his jaw. Dean had only ever seen him from a distance, ensuring the gifts, the support, the quiet acts of kindness reached him anonymously. Arthur sat in a small waiting room staring out a window at the greying sky. His shoulders were slumped, a picture of quiet resignation. As Dean approached, Arthur turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. Mr. Martin, I wasn't aware you were coming today." "Arthur," Dean said, his voice surprisingly steady. He held out the package. "This is for you, from your father." Arthur's eyes widened, then narrowed in suspicion. "My father? He passed away when I was a boy. What is this?" Dean took a deep breath. 25 years ago, Arthur, your father asked me for a favour, a deeply personal one. He was a brave man, and he deserved to know his son would be cared for even after he was gone. He entrusted me with a legacy for you, one I promised to deliver when the time was right." Dean watched Arthur's face carefully, seeing the dawning comprehension, the flicker of confusion giving way to a dawning understanding. "A legacy?" Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. He took the package, his fingers trembling slightly as he undid the simple twine. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue, lay a worn leather-bound journal and a heavy engraved silver locket. He opened the journal to the first page, his father's distinctive, elegant handwriting filling the lines. "My dearest Arthur," he read aloud, his voice cracking. "If you are reading this, it means Dean has kept his word. He is a man of honour." Tears welled in Arthur's eyes as he continued to read, the words of a father he barely remembered reaching across decades, revealing a story of a silent guardian. The tension in the room was palpable, a fragile bridge between past and present. Dean simply stood, his own heart a mixture of relief and raw emotion. His vow finally fulfilled. The secret finally unveiled. The secret revealed. The air in the small, cluttered study hung heavy with the scent of aging paper as Maria, after all these years, finally confronted the poignant necessary task of sorting through her father's belongings. Her gaze snagged on a substantial leather-bound journal, its spine a roadmap of cracks. This was no meticulously kept ledger. It radiated a different aura, almost sacrosanct. She brushed a hand over the scuffed cover, noting a faint impression where something had once been affixed. Inside, her father's elegant script filled the pages, but these weren't his usual business entries. Here were reflections, observations, and, to her bewilderment, detailed records of inexplicable financial transactions. Large sums were dispersed quarterly, sometimes monthly, always to varying names and bank accounts, yet the underlying pattern remained stubbornly consistent, stretching back decades. A crease formed between her brows. What was this enigma? Her father, a man of unimpeachable honesty, had seemed an open book. Then, tucked between entries detailing a particularly significant payment in 1958, she discovered it, a single brittle sheet yellowed with age, penned in a hand utterly unlike her father's. The signature, though faded, was unmistakable. Dean Martin. Maria gasped, a sharp, dusty intake of breath laced with disbelief. Dean Martin? Her father had never uttered a word about knowing the legendary singer. The letter was terse, almost brusque, yet its message resonated with solemn gravity. Enclosed is the usual quarterly disbursement for the project. I trust it reaches the intended parties. My word is my bond, and I will see this through as promised. Please maintain our strict confidentiality. Maria's pulse hammered. The project? She breathed, her voice a mere whisper in the quiet room. Her eyes darted back through the journal, connecting the payment dates to the chronology of her own childhood. Her father's quiet sacrifices, the unexplained extra shifts he'd taken. A cold dread mingled with profound awe began to coalesce within her. A memory surfaced, a faded photograph, long forgotten in a shoebox, of her youthful father standing beside a handsome, dark-haired man in a military uniform, his arm in a sling. The image had always been an unresolved puzzle. Racing to the attic, her thoughts a whirlwind, she located the shoebox beneath a mound of old blankets. She retrieved the photograph. The man in uniform. His features were eerily familiar. Leaning closer, her fingers tracing the faint curve of his smile, she knew it was undeniably Dean Martin. But not the jovial celebrity. This was a younger, more somber Dean, his eyes mirroring a profound, untold sorrow. The disparate pieces of the puzzle now aligned with unsettling clarity. Her father, a humble bookkeeper, had been the silent, steadfast conduit for Dean Martin's secret pledge, a vow forged on a distant battlefield, upheld for a lifetime, and paid for with a fortune. The true cost, however, lay in the quiet devotion, the unwavering commitment, and the deep, unspoken sacrifice. A golden heart remembered. The scent of stale cigarette smoke, a familiar ghost in his dressing room, usually offered Dean a measure of comfort. Tonight, it felt like a shroud. He stared at the yellowing newspaper clipping, its edges brittle as old promises. The headline, faded almost to illegibility, spoke of a local boy, a war hero, gone too soon. It was Private Thomas Tommy Miller. Dean remembered the name, the face, the quiet plea in a sterile hospital room that still echoed in his mind, sharp and clear despite the quarter century that had passed. Just make sure she's all right, Dean, Tommy had whispered, his breath ragged. My sister, Clara, she's all I got left. Dean had gripped the young man's hand, the skin surprisingly rough for someone so frail. I promise, kid. On my word. A promise, made to a dying soldier, a secret burden he had carried with the same stoicism he brought to the stage. Tommy's vision of Clara had been of a bright-eyed girl, full of laughter. The reality, when Dean first found her years later, was a woman worn thin by hardship, her spirit flickering like a dying candle. She'd been living in a cramped apartment above a noisy diner, barely making ends meet with a seamstress job that paid next to nothing. He remembered the first anonymous check sent through a trusted lawyer, disguised as a distant relative's inheritance. Clara, bless her unassuming heart, had attributed it to divine intervention. He'd continued the practice, adjusting the amounts over the years, ensuring she always had enough for rent, food, a little extra for comforts he knew Tommy would have wanted for her. A new coat in winter, a doctor's visit, an occasional trip to the coast she'd always dreamed of. Tonight, however, the weight felt heavier. His assistant, a harried young man named Frankie, knocked tentatively. "Mr. Martin, the car's waiting. You're on in 20. Dean folded into the clipping and tucked it back into his wallet, a well-worn leather testament to a life lived in dual realities. "Be right there, Frankie." On stage, under the blinding glare of the spotlights, Dean was the epitome of effortless charm, his voice a smooth caress, but a tiny, almost imperceptible knot tightened in his stomach. He'd received a letter that morning, forwarded from the lawyer. Clara was ill, not just a cold, but something more serious. The medical bills would be substantial. The crowd roared, hanging on every note, every easy smile. Dean, however, was calculating. A new show was in the works, a lucrative engagement, but it meant travel, time away. Time he couldn't afford to lose if Clara needed him, even if him remained an anonymous benefactor. The tension was a subtle hum beneath the music, a discordant note in an otherwise perfect melody. He had to ensure her care, find a way to cover the costs without raising suspicion, without ever revealing the silent vow he'd made all those years ago. The promise wasn't just about money, it was about presence, about making sure Clara never truly felt alone. And now, more than ever, she needed him.